From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. We're delighted to be welcoming back to the library two very distinguished artists, Kim Kashkashian and Péter Nagy. I'm Anne McLean from the library's concert office, and my colleague David Pilar is joining us. We'll be talking about the music you'll hear tonight: Robert Schumann, László Tihanyi, Béla Bartók, and Johannes Brahms, about Hungarian music in particular, and about the art of transcription, since the Schumann and the Bartók works are versions that Kim has created as transcriptions for viola. So we'll need all four of us to tackle this. Later on in our conversation, we'll be talking about the Tuscan Medici Stradivari viola, a remarkable instrument that meets a remarkable interpreter tonight. Not their first meeting, I should say. We'll talk about its history a little bit later on, and its life in the U.S. with the family of Cameron and Jane Baird before coming here to the library as a loan from the Tuscan Corporation. We're delighted to be continuing a focus on this instrument, featured also last week in the world premiere of a new viola concerto by Jennifer Higdon. I think some of you were here for that. It was a new Library of Congress commission. Roberto Diaz was the soloist, and the orchestra was the Curtis Chamber Orchestra. So we look forward tonight to hearing its voice now in this very intimate duo setting. Just to give a little background for a moment on our artists, they're both very much admired for musical integrity, one of the most meaningful compliments I think you hear said about a performer. Both have won many prizes that speak to this quality. Kim is a recipient of the George Peabody Medal for exceptional contributions to music and the Edison Prize, among quite a few others. A somewhat startling Grammy Award, which we can touch on later, for a very eloquent recording of solo viola works by Hungarian composers Ligeti and Kurtag. And Péter has won the prestigious Liszt Prize and is the director of the doctoral program for pianists at the Franz Liszt Academy in Budapest. So with this background, let's start by talking a little bit about the Schumann, which you have transcribed, and about the art of transcription. You and David can take that away.
Well, sure. I guess my first question would be, the Schumann, for people who don't know this piece, it first came about where Schumann himself gave multiple options for how it could be performed with different instruments. I think the first instantiation was for a clarinet in A, but then you adapted it, and maybe you could speak a bit to that process.
Well, there are also, is this on? Okay, is that better? Yeah, okay. There are multiple versions. The violin and cello versions are old, and I just have to preface the idea of transcription by saying that by definition, a violist has to be a thief. And we would not survive except if we were string quartet players or orchestral players, repertoire-wise, unless we were willing to play compositions originally written for other instruments. And I have always used as a guideline making a transcription that I'll use the analogy of a kaleidoscope. You see something or hear something, and you take the kaleidoscope and you turn it. And you can turn it and the colors change. The pattern shifts, therefore. But you still have the essential structure. And that's how I define a good transcription, is if I've changed the view of the piece but kept the essential structure. So character can shift. Clothing, the clothing you wear, it shifts. The bone structure stays the same. Yeah.
I don't want to jump ahead, but in some ways with the Fantasiestücke, the Schumann, there's a little bit of of a sense that you can shift octave transpositions and things like that. But with the Bartok, it's quite another matter because it feels like it's so idiomatically written for the violin originally. Of course, there was the cello version too, but did you approach it in a different way?
I'm going to try all the microphones. I think that with the Schumann, you'll find that I've also done some octave shifting, which in a way proves the value of the transcription, that you can see original octave work and you can actually then hear, for example, a repetition done in a lower or a higher, as the case may be, octave, which is like turning that kaleidoscope. And in the case of the Bartok, I think that most of those melodies survive in multiple octaves. And in fact, sometimes it's better to have a wider range. And my goal would be not to compress the range, but rather to make it bigger.
So in the Bartok, there's certain effects that require open strings and things like that. And of course, the viola has a different extra string, or well, same amount of strings, but a different string than Bartok had to use in the violin version. Are you still, when you're transcribing, are you still looking to create similar types of sonic effects as to what he's able to do with that sort of a thing?
Yes, sometimes by shifting the voicing. I rarely will leave something out. Well, I should give away my secrets. There are 2 bars at the end where I'm leaving out a double stop. But a lot of that E string stuff I'm actually playing.
Okay, so you didn't just tell Peter to play it down a fifth? Or...
Oh, no, we can't do that. No, we're playing in the original keys. And of course, having the model of the cello version also was very helpful. It gave me the courage to say, well, look, if he did that, then I can do this. It's a parallel situation. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks.
To continue with the Bartok Rhapsody, I wanted to ask all 3 of you to talk about the structure and the melody, the melodic elements of this piece and its basis in Hungarian folk music, particularly maybe some background on the complex issues about the titles that we always see printed in the programs, and we don't know as much about them as we would like to, Lassú and Friss, and their relationship to melodies that he collected in his Romanian folk collection. Folk melodies.
Yes, so it's lassú and friss. It gives a bit more character. Yeah. No, I would like to say, just going back to the viola version, that I really like it on the viola. I play with violin also a lot, but somehow the viola contributes some earthiness and gravitation, which wonderfully contributes to this dancey character of the piece. What was the next?
Well, actually, before we jump back to the Bartok structure, let me ask you how you and Kim knew each other. How did you come to work together? How long have you collaborated?
Well, I was a student of her. Well, for one lesson.
No.
For one lesson.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
It was in Bloomington when I studied in Bloomington for 3 years, and
I was a young instructor there, and he was playing with one of my viola students. So they came for working on the Schumann Märchenbilder together. But we really met at a festival in the north, right?
No.
I'll say, we're a little foggy here.
No, you called me simply in Budapest that I was recommended to, because that was the time when Robert Levin moved back to America.
And also, we had a Kortág-Rados connection.
Yes.
Yeah. I was very interested in things Hungarian, partly because I had worked a lot with the composer Kortág, and I knew that he had a compatriot named Rados, who was a pianist and also did a lot of coaching and working with artists on all kinds of music. And I knew that Peter was working with him. And a violinist friend of mine, Leonidas Kavakos, was also working together with Peter at that time. So, as always, the threads connected in many ways.
I know that this afternoon you all looked at a Franz Liszt manuscript that David had found for you of the Csárdas, a very late piano work, and maybe this would be an interesting path into some of the Hungarian music we're going to look at. What was your, what did you find that was of interest in that manuscript?
What was interesting? Well, that's the right same notes that I'm playing, so I was happy. So it's interesting that you bring this up, the Csárdas, because that's such a different concept for Liszt, what the Hungarian music meant, and for Bartok. And this would, of course, lead to a very long and strenuous conversation to describe the difference, what Bartok thought of Hungarian folk music and Liszt, how Liszt met the so-called metropolitan folk music in the cities. But returning to the Rhapsody today, this is very interesting because these are folk melodies, but not totally folk melodies in that sense that he used only the second melody in the first part. That's a complete folk song, but the others are fragments of folk songs or imitation of folk songs. And he wrote in one of his letters, this is the highest level when a composer can write a folk song which exactly sounds like a folk song.
I found that a couple of comments on that. A quote that he made himself, as you say, exactly this. These melodies are the embodiment of an artistic perfection of the highest order. In fact, they are models of the way in which a musical idea can be expressed with utmost perfection in terms of brevity of form and simplicity of means. To keep going with this a bit further, we were talking about Romania, what is present-day Romania. This is the area in which Bartok collected these. But I found a comment in the program notes for the CD, which I'll show you in a minute. I can't resist showing these CDs, saying that Bartok, Ligeti, Kurtag, and Péter Ötvös all came from one area in what he calls a, quote, Hungarian enclave. That was kind of fascinating for me to know that they might all have been embraced or have embraced this kinds of melodic contours and, you know, in their deep unconscious perhaps, but...
Something must be in that area.
Yeah, exactly.
Contaminated, yes.
You know, it's an interesting point because we're becoming more and more homogenous in our awareness, and for musicians it's of course in some ways it's a blessing because we can learn from everybody, but it can also be the opposite of a blessing because none of us is as grounded as perhaps used to be the case. And by grounded, I mean quite literally, geographically. Therefore, you know, the earth tastes a certain way. The trees smell a certain way. The language has a certain intonation that creates a kind of melody, both in speech and in song. And that is what Bartok meant by the highest art form. It's a kind of balance that it's possible to lose if you lose your roots. So a lot of musicians are looking back to find those roots, both for themselves personally and for the music that they're playing, and trying to interpret, in a sense, in a more simple way, what is written on the page. To say, okay, if this were speech, what would be happening? And that's for me a very important question, no matter what I'm playing now, including Bach. Yeah.
If I could just jump in for one quick question on that. With the Bartok Rhapsody, both of you have spoken of the simplicity of the folk tunes and things like that, but maybe to some ears, the actual settings are not really that simple. And in fact, there's quite a bit of activity going on that's, in particular, very Bartokian and unique and interesting. And what about that particular contribution as opposed to, you know, just a setting?
I would like to comment on that. It's very interesting because I work with folk musicians a bit, and I ask them, so how do you play this rhythm? And of course, they never studied in normal schools, so they don't know what is ta, 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 ta. They just only feel some kind of balance between long and short, yes, like a dancer would, so not an exact. So we were talking with Kim that I told her that I saw the Bartok notation of some folk songs, and it's what's the word? Meticulously notated. So not just a normal dotted written, but with quintolas and sextolas, and so extremely clear, the value. And in the normal notation in his scores, those are notated by the Western standard. So one wonders why didn't he notate it with such delicate measures, to imitate the folk musician's style.
And I said maybe it's because when he wrote those pieces, he knew that the musicians would understand the intonation and where a dotted eighth and a 16th was actually closer to a triplet and when it was closer to a double dotted, because they would have a background for it. So it's an interesting thing with any written notation. You either do it very simply and hope that people will be able to make that human and speech translation, or you try to really very, very, very precisely notate exactly what's happening. And Bartok wanted to do that when he transcribed his findings from the country and from the folk, because he wanted to have an actual picture of what was going on. Maybe it was a challenge for him to do that.
And when we hear he's playing, he doesn't follow his score.
Match.
You know, it was, I was talking with David about this earlier. In 2008, we had a fascinating program with the Takas Quartet appearing with Muzikash, Muzikash, and Marta Sebastian. This is great because we've wondered about some of these. The wonderful Hungarian singer, Marta Sebastian. And so, Sebastian. So we will keep going.
Slur everything.
Yeah, right. We put a lot of Z in here from now on. But what was fascinating was to hear them play in between Bartok's composed works some folk music that was related very closely to this, and it was almost ghostly, because the folk fiddling style, you would hear these melodies which very clearly were the inspiration, and there you could hear them so well. But back to back, well, I think, Andras, you were probably here for that. Yeah, several people in the audience I know were here. It was just magical. And there were also played at that evening some transcription recordings, field recordings, which truly were eerie and beautiful and evocative. So anyway, that's if you ever have a chance to hear these artists doing this repertoire, you really must. One final thought on this, which will relate to the string playing. We found a comment about the Hungarian violin school, saying that some of the string writing in this work was related to a style that came from Jenő Hubay. How is that? Not bad. So sophisticated bowing and variable vibrato and so on. Does that ring a bell or sound this Hubay connection with the style of the playing, actually?
Let me make a contemporary comment. I think that with the development of steel strings and higher pitch and higher bridges and increasing tension on the instruments, we have, as a general picture, lost a great deal of color, articulation possibilities, and general roundness of sound, charm in the sound. So when we look back, we're looking at not only a style, but a set of physical capabilities that have affected us and changed things a little bit. So we have to actually work harder than 50 years ago even, to get those kinds of finessed articulations and color changes, and the fact that a sound has both a duration and a shape. Those things are no longer considered normal, and they should be.
And going from this into the modern piece that we'll hear tonight, I understand, well, first let's get the pronunciation from the expert.
Tihanyi László.
Okay. David has made a study of this, and why don't you ask some questions about the structure?
Oh, sure. Well, I haven't heard the piece yet. I'm really looking forward to it because it looks very exciting on the page. I guess my first question, or first thing, I'll just preface this by saying this piece can be played in different order, not actually in a different order, but you can start at different points and then arrive back at that beginning, not necessarily actually at the beginning, but it's based on the lunar phases. You can say a bit more about that, but my first question would be, are you planning on offering alternative start and stop points in your touring with this work, or are you going to be exploring that aspect of it, that sort of to emphasize its cyclic nature?
I think that the next phase of us doing this piece, we will definitely be doing more experimenting. We performed the work in Europe in November, and this is the first North American set of concerts, and we both felt that we wanted to do it, to give it that space to do as he wrote the first time, and then we already have talked about making a suite out of it, changing, maybe shortening, making it. I shouldn't say this, but it's very long and complex, and it takes patience to understand from beginning to end. Even for us, after many repetitions and working on it very hard, we're only beginning to understand the whole, or at least I am only beginning to understand the whole. I won't speak for him. It takes, like when first Beethoven was heard, it took time. And this takes time too, and patience. Yeah.
Well, one of the fascinating things about it is that there's this almost Schumann-esque insertion of motto ideas between them. Maybe you can...
The mottos are so amazingly sparse. They're so, it's as if he asked the question, what can I live without? What do I not need? And he's left with a very, very, very evocative, he calls them mottos, but you could call them, I think of them as intuitive statements that move you to the next section of the piece. And they're, in a way, the opposite of the actual movements, which are very full of notes. And then he's got all these mottos which are as bare as possible. So I think there's some kind of, in his mind, some kind of alternation of texture and meaning. Yeah.
And there also, the piano part is really remarkable in this terms of texture, particularly what I heard from you this afternoon. Any comments on the piano writing?
Yes, it's very difficult, but it's a very visual piece for me also. So he himself says that he loves movies and he thinks of paintings and pictures. At the same time, lots of notes for me. So I have to combine these two things somehow to find the right gestures and play the right notes. So.
I've read that he felt that Russian music has been influential for him. He also cited Russian film, Eisenstein and Tarkovsky.
One other thing about this piece that struck me, and I'm not sure if this is just reading too much into the idea of orbiting, is that you have these elements of extremely precise playing together, synchronicity, and then you have these points where you're not together. You're not supposed to be playing in exactly the same way. And does that seem to be a kind of a dramatic force that's maybe not necessarily as, well, I guess it would be pretty audible, but maybe we wouldn't necessarily be the wiser, not looking at the score, but does that play a role in this?
This has just come to me because I hadn't thought about that question, but I think of those sections as partial eclipses. It's the beginning of something really strange.
Fantastic. So if it gets slightly darker, don't look directly well, it would be a lunar eclipse, though, so it should be okay. But.
Well, I loved all the imagery in your notes about the waxing and waning and the gibbous moon and so forth, and I think this piece is very... You talked about choosing it when you chose a program, and you said it would be challenging, and I wanted to make the point that your career has really brought tremendous amounts of new music that have been challenging to the fore, and we can talk about that in relation to the viola and what you've done to champion it. But before we talk about the viola, I just wondered if you both would like to talk a little bit about Kurtag's music in the consideration of these great Hungarian masters, since you've worked with them so very much. And a couple of things in particular, the gesture, the use of gesture, aphoristic melodic lines, and something very interesting I've read about where they were saying he uses layers of gestures. How does that translate into what an audience perceives? And is this something you hear in other Hungarian work?
Do you want to speak to that? You go ahead. Okay. I think that the idea of layers of gesture, it's a beautiful way of describing something that also exists in Bach and Brahms, and not only in Hungarian music. So I love that idea, layers of gesture, but I don't see it as unique to Kurtag. What is perhaps unique to Kurtag is that he, along with Webern, managed to do the most potent things and the most distilled things with the least possible material, chosen with great effort. He once said to me, I was complaining about how difficult it was to work and to practice. I was in a bad phase, and it's just, I don't feel like going further. And he said, well, it's torture. Every note that I find, I torture myself until it's the right note. So,
I remember reading that you did so much with, like, he would work several hours on just a few lines together.
this is true.
It's torture, but at the same time, it's like the notes are his house pets. No, come here. Here. Sit next to me. Now. Yes. So taming the notes.
Yeah. Well, he's notorious for working an interpretive artist until they're in a small puddle at his feet also. I've seen him reduce many strong men to tears. And then he looks at you and says, why are you crying? We're all one big family. Musical family. And he does it out of love. And one senses that. So, yeah.
Let's talk a little more about the contemporary pieces that you have been involved with, both of you, and what are some of your projects now and so on. In terms of viola collaborations, really, you've worked with great names, in addition to Kurtag, Penderecki, Arvo Pärt, Tigran Mansourian, Concheli, and so on. What projects interest the two of you now for new music at this moment? What are some of your next projects?
We're waiting rather impatiently for the full score of a Mansourian duet that he's written for us, a sonata, which we will be performing in Istanbul at the Istanbul Music Festival in June. It's very courageous of them. They're basically highlighting the Armenian genocide in a country that doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide, and they've chosen to do so by bringing an Armenian musician and asking for an Armenian composer to write a work for that program. So that's what we're doing next.
That's wonderful. And you're also doing music by Komitas Vardapet, I believe, or was that the last time you were in Istanbul?
We'll do more of that too. Father Komitas was actually the analog situation to Bartok. He was a priest, but he was a musician, a singer, and pianist. And he went around to all the Armenian villages and collected and transcribed the folk songs. And we were talking about this idea of rhythmic precision in Bartok's archival work. And I was saying it's so interesting because Komidas did the same kind of precise, almost impossible to notate in Western notation. He tried to describe the melodic variation, not the rhythmic, but the melodic. So they're called neumes, and there are many, many, many layers within a pitch. So when we do those, it actually shouldn't be with piano because the piano is stuck on one pitch and I move around it. Yeah, so.
Fascinating. Let's move to a question of a couple of things about the viola, and I have to ask, you were saying when you moved back to the U.S. from living in Europe for a long time, I read something about the enjoyable but naive impression that the viola is a solo instrument like any other. But you said American violists are still acting like missionaries, and you wanted to enliven the viola world in the U.S. Why is it so difficult? Why is there a big gap between what is happening in Europe in this regard and here in the U.S.?
Well, this is only a theory, and it's got many layers to it, but it has to do with the financial infrastructure of orchestras. In Germany especially, but in most of Western Europe, the orchestras are supported by the government to a great extent, and therefore given permission to include new works in their programming. Okay, that has now become more common here, but it was always part of the picture there. And look at what we have for viola concertos. They're all 20th and 21st century works with the exception of Mozart, which is a double concerto. So I would play, in those years when I was living in Europe, I would be asked to play multiple times in a year, Schnittke concerto or Penderecki concerto or Berio concerto. And those pieces are, in this country, exclusively saved for the principal violist of the orchestra. There are no viola soloists that come from the outside in this country for that reason, because the one contemporary viola piece is given to, and quite rightly, given to the principal violist. So it's an infrastructure question, really.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have understood. That's very helpful, because I always wondered, and I've been so amazed what you've been able to do for the viola. And we talked with kind of kiddingly a couple of weeks ago with a young artist named Misha Amory about an article recently about how the viola is now a marquee instrument, and that phrase just really makes me laugh. But it's very sweet, because you see a lot of great new recordings coming out for this instrument. And I had in my bag earlier some of the ones that Kim has recorded, quite a number of interesting and widely ranging recordings on the ECM label, going back as early. I'm one of the people who have the Kim Kashkashian, Keith Jarrett CD of the Gamba Sonatas. But very recently, as I mentioned earlier, she won a Grammy for Kurtog and Ligeti solo viola, which is extraordinary. The disc is extraordinary. And then maybe mention something about your Tre Voce album. That's very new. Do you want to say what that is, or the?
Tre Voce is the name of a chamber group, which is flute, viola, and harp. And we met at Marlboro and started to play together as a group outside of Marlboro just about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And we just love to play together. Sivan Magen is the harpist, and Maria Piccinini is the flute player. And we did a recording of Takamitsu, Gubaidulina, and Debussy trios, all original for that combination of instruments. Yeah. And we're in the process of commissioning from Canuino.
And in terms of your recordings, I just wanted the audience to know that you have done this amazing roster of recordings for Naxos. You want to say a little bit about that? It's quite extraordinary.
Well, that was a long time ago, so I already forgot. Yes, but I did also some recordings for ECM. And there's Decca. I'm more interested in my new recordings than the Naxos.
And what are the some of the most recent ones?
Recent one is Decca, actually, the Bartok Rhapsodies with Leonidas Kavakos. And then I also recorded complete violin piano music for Berlin Classics with a German violinist. So.
To bring this around to the instrument a little bit and maybe focus, I wanted to say that in your program notes, which David has written tonight, another beautiful job, which go into the structure and so forth, you can find a lot about the Tihanya piece, but there's a note about the viola, and I wanted to mention this because we wanted to acknowledge the family of Jane and Cameron Baird who are here, and to say you can read a little bit about its background and to talk with Kim a little bit about the sound of the viola and what you feel working with it and so on. I wanted to ask you what is your reaction to this in terms of just the pure sound?
You know, let Peter say this first because my ear is right next to it, so that's not as reliable as what he's hearing from the outside.
In terms of the sound of the instrument, or?
Yeah, and what it makes me do differently, etc.
Well, of course, Stradivari has a very distinguished character of sound, so the difference was right away very striking from the Greiner instrument Kim is playing. But I also went to hear it from the hall, from a bit outside, not from my seat at the piano, and it does require a different kind of playing on it. Yeah. It does require a different approach. It does require a different, not attack, but articulation of the left hand, I would think, or the bow also. Both. And but I must say that she found right away how to handle the instrument beautifully.
Well, they are. The Strad viola is a very special animal. Because most of them are they have a higher voice. They're not low altos. They're not the big, thick, warm, enveloping sound that one anticipates. But my Greiner is also relatively focused and rather more soprano than dark. So in terms of the voice, it's actually not that far away. In terms of how to play it, it's of course very different. It's the difference between riding in a Mercedes and in a Mack truck. And so I'm used to a Mack truck. And suddenly I've got all of the possibilities of the Mercedes at my fingertips, and I just have to know how to use them.
We just want to say that this viola was used by the family of the Bears in their own family festive chamber evenings. They bought it in 1957 and used it for those children and family meetings for a long time. We have acquired it in 1977 as a loan from the Tuscan Corporation, which is the family's corporation. So we're very grateful to them for making it available. And I think you'll hear it tonight. It's just remarkable in the terms of sound and presence. It speaks in a way like few instruments do. So we're going to open for questions for a little while, but maybe, David, is there anything you want to talk about in terms of the Brahms and other points?
No, I was just thinking about this with respect to the, I know that you said at the beginning, when we first started talking, that the violist has to be something of a thief in order to get access to these, but in the case of the Brahms, and in some extent, the case of the Schumann, there's a sense where Brahms actually did write a part that was for the viola, and so you know that it has that authenticity, but also but both of them seem to have this variable approach to their late chamber music. In Brahms, in this case, the very latest chamber music, and for Schumann, I mean, this is towards the end of his career writing chamber music, to where they would allow the possibility of multiple voices, varying from a wind to a string. How does that affect the way, do you think about the clarinet approach at all when you're looking at the viola sonata, or one of the two sonatas, or do you take ownership of it in a different way? I don't know. It's just it's an interesting thing to me that there's this, such different instruments can still be okay to use by the composer.
Well, I'm curious to know if Peter agrees with this, but I do feel that the E-flat sonata, the one we're playing tonight, leans more towards string expression, and the F minor perhaps leans more towards wind expression. So when I play the F minor, I try to think a little bit more about a simple focus, and in the E flat, I allow a lot more color and cantabile feeling to flow into the music.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that. But in the E-flat, it's a late piece, but it's such a fire inside still, such a conviction. And also, I think I would like to praise our programming a bit, because it's wonderfully fit with Bartok, because in Brahms, there is also some Hungarian element in the music. We know that Brahms like to use these Werbung motifs, the Hungarian dances. In some of the pieces comes this Werbung dance, rhythmical sense, and at the end of the piece, the coda, one can hear that very well.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's when I had the good fortune to work through this piece with Mr. Kortak, and he got to exactly that place, and he looked up at me and he said, "Czardas."
Yeah, the Werbung is the origin of the Czardas. So Czardas comes from Werbung. Werbung is very old-fashioned dance coming from the Rákóczi time. Maybe you all, you know what I'm talking about, this period. And
are you going to show us?
Maybe later.
That's a wonderful tying into the connections that we've talked about, this way of ending our part of this. And does anyone have questions for the artists? No?
That means we did a good job.
Or a bad job.
There's one.
I think there's one up here.
Yeah.
I was just curious if it might be appropriate for Kim to speak to her leadership on issues of hunger and musicians involved with hunger relief.
Thank you, Anne. Well, 5 years ago, we began a project, a musicians' initiative to help fight hunger, and it's called Music for Food. And right now, the website is Music for Food Boston. That's where I live. We felt, a group of us got together one night, and we were basically complaining about the situation our students found themselves in, of feeling isolated, and not everybody can aim for Carnegie Hall, and what do the rest of them do, and how we could provide them perhaps with a vehicle where they could use their talents, their gifts, the thing they were working so hard for, and also be involved in their community, rooted in their community, and also get the audience to be part of an active picture, so that we're creating a community chamber music between the artists, the audience who are contributing, and the food pantry, which is receiving. So we do benefit concerts. When I say we, this is now happening all over the country and even in Germany, and somebody wants to start it in Taiwan. It's getting out of hand. I had no idea this would happen. Musicians want to participate. They want to be part of their communities, and this is a really great way to do it. It brings the audience feels responsible and active, which is another thing that needs to happen. And the musicians feel that they're giving. And I have to say that when we play a chamber concert, there's a very different feel to it. You can play the same piece a week later in a concert hall. It doesn't feel the same as doing it for this purpose. So, is that what you wanted? Yeah, okay.
May 17th.
And our first Washington, D.C. event is going to be on May 17th in Bethesda. Yeah. So the information will be up on what website? Where are you putting it up?
Yours.
Mine. Okay. You have to look on Music for Food Boston, and you will find evidence of Music for Food in Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, and now Washington, D.C., May 17th. I'm going to be playing violin in the orchestra. And two wonderful young violists, one of whom was my student, are going to play Viola Concertos, both together and separately.
You mentioned how meticulous Bartok was in transcribing his field recordings, and I wanted to ask both of you what other information you get from listening to the actual field recordings, the actual music.
Bartok himself.
No, the field recordings themselves.
Oh, the folk musicians.
Yeah, the wax cylinders.
Oh, yes. Yes. But there is the Bartok collection. Actually, it's widely available in the book. And well, it's a very interesting question because so what do? We imitate it, or or we listen 150 million times, it comes to our mind and it comes naturally. So it's very dangerous in some ways because one cannot imitate that. You just have to be born that way and to be able to do it. But still, one tries to sniff it up, so to speak, or try to get some taste. And then sometimes it works better, sometimes it's not so.
I would just add that Peter, of course, has the unconscious advantage or conscious advantage of language, of knowing the language. So when I listen, I'm listening also to absorb ideas about rhythm and intonation in the language, which I will try to translate into my music.
So I would like to add, it's not an intellectual process, it's more a physical process. Because if you look at the dancers, they just have this wonderful ecstasy of rhythm. Yeah? They don't think, they don't calculate, they just feel it the right way.
Anyone else?
Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you in a moment.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.